Hello, and welcome to episode 6 of Project Slave 1. In the last episode, you'll have seen how I finally managed to get the basic structure of Slave 1's main hull assembled, and even made a start on the detailing. The basic shape of Slave 1 is now pretty good. It's a little too broad behind the cockpit, and the sides should be flatter, but that's down to the original base model, but I can live with that. I'm very happy with the character this model now has, and I'm finally ready to move on to the next stage of this build, adding the detail. Starting with the tail section, I've marked out in pencil where I want to add panels to recreate the surface detail of the original Slave 1 model. I thought I'd start here as it would be the simplest area to add the styrene sheet to that I was going to use for the panels. Gluing styrene onto styrene, I could just use regular solvent adhesive, but on other areas of the hull, where I'd be gluing onto filler, I'd have to use superglue. Referring back to the original studio scale model, I reckon I'd need several different thicknesses of styrene to recreate the same effect. And these were the sheets I settled on. The 3mm sheet was only needed for the large panel on the left-hand side behind the cockpit. The majority of the panels were going to be cut from 0.5mm or 20 thou sheet. In some areas I knew I needed to go thinner, so I selected 0.25mm or 10 thou sheet, which is so thin you can see through it. The styrene went on really well, and this gave me confidence to tackle the next stage. I could now move on to the rest of the hull. I still had some panel lines to add to the shoulder bells and nose section. These together with the main panels were marked out with a fine marker pen. Some of these panels and panel lines curved in two directions, and I knew they were going to be particularly difficult to get flat and straight. At this stage I also thinned down the edges of the openings for the wings, and built up one of the lower hull edges with styrene and isopon car body filler. After a few evenings of careful scribing, I was finally happy with the result. One of the most difficult aspects of the scribing was to get the lines symmetrical where they needed to be. They don't show up terribly well here, but trust me, they're there. It took a lot of careful study of the studio scale photos to get to this stage. I now remarked all the panel lines in pencil with a dot in the middle so that they'd show up on the 3D prints. My reason for this was to remove any ink from the marker pens, which could bleed through the paint when it came to spraying. There are a lot of panels on the shoulder bells made from thin strip, and these I decided to make from my thinnest sheet styrene. They certainly looked very thin on the studio scale model, and on closer inspection I could see from a damaged panel that it appeared to be tape rather than styrene. I guess back in the day, speed was more important than longevity, and that's the choice they made. At the rear of the hull there's a row of vents, and I'd been wondering for a while what would be the best method of recreating them. I had thought of using styrene, but getting all the angles right I knew was going to be a total nightmare. I started by tracing around the edge of the lower hull and drew another line inboard to match the upper curve. These curves were then subdivided and the points joined to create the correct fan pattern. I then scanned the drawing into my 3D modelling software and traced off the basic shape I wanted for the lower profile. This outline, or spline, was then copied and raised to create the profile for the upper edge. The two profiles were then joined together to create a 3D object. This was then exported to my slicer software to prepare the part for 3D printing. I decided to print it in ABS on my Ultimaker, as it would be easier to bond to the main hull. Had I printed it in resin, it would have been better defined, but less durable. As you can see, the layer lines are very prominent, but I wasn't worried, as they'd be easily filed out. And here it is, cleaned up and glued into the main hull. It fits really well and carries the line of the bottom edge of the hull perfectly. Back in the day when these spaceships were made by hand, detail was added to the surface of these masterpieces by the addition of parts from readily available plastic kits. These parts became known as Greeblies. In some instances they were used to portray a convincing mechanical part, but in most cases they were just to provide detail or interest to the surface of the model. Slave 1 is a great example of the use of parts harvested from model kits. The wings and engine parts are almost entirely built from kit parts. The art comes in trying to work out exactly what kit the parts were taken from. We'll be looking at some of those in the following episodes, but right now let's tackle the Creeplies on the outer hull and tail. Based on my previous sketch drawings for the tail, I designed the parts I needed in my CAD software. They were only small parts, so there was no point trying to hunt down plastic kits. Even here you can recognise some of the parts are from 1/35th scale model tank kits. I laid the parts out to fit on my resin 3D printer, duplicating them to make sure I had a few spares. The file was then exported to my slicer software, where the support structure was automatically added. After a few hours, the prints were ready and could be removed from the build plate with a scalpel. The support structure then had to be carefully cut away and the parts further cleaned up by hand. At this stage, the resin is fully cured and very brittle, which can cause the parts to be damaged when they're removed from the build plate. To prevent this, the parts are often removed prior to being fully cured, while the resin is still slightly soft. Again, this has to be done very carefully, so the prints don't deform. Being only small parts, cleaning them up didn't take long and my Greeblies were ready to be fitted. If you're enjoying this build series, make sure you subscribe to my channel so you catch the next episode when it goes live. If you have any questions about Project Slave 1, leave them in the comments and I'll get back to you. Right, let's take a look at the left-hand side of Slave 1 with all the detail now added. The white parts are all styrene, with the part near the back made from a variety of strip section. The vertical louvres are cut from triangular section styrene strip laid together, and the blue parts are the Greeblies I printed earlier. The front of the hull has been detailed in the same manner, with styrene. You can see the strips over the shoulders have now been added, as well as the larger panels on the lower skirt. The large holes on the side of the nose are deliberately at different heights. The right-hand side of the hull has also had the styrene treatment, again paying careful attention to the reference photos. This time I turned up a brass rod in my Dremel for the extra detail. The end and underside of the tail is where most of the Greeblies live. Here in their natural habitat, fed on a diet of superglue, they cluster together, providing detail and interest, patiently awaiting a coat of primer when they can really come to life. Now for the final part of the upper hull detailing, the guns. Again, these were designed in my CAD software. They had to fit into the mounts in the tail section and point vertically when finally installed. I've seen models where they are at odd angles and it really doesn't look good. How Boba would have been expected to hit anything I really don't know. He certainly had a better aim than a stormtrooper. I beefed up the gun barrels slightly to make them look a bit more credible. The originals were taken from kit parts. Fortunately, by designing just one side, I can duplicate the parts and mirror them so that I have a gun for each side of Slave 1. The parts are then exported into the slicer software for resin printing, where the supports are again added automatically. As you can see, the print bed for this resin printer isn't very big, which does limit what I can comfortably print. I do have a solution for this problem, but you'll have to wait till the next episode to see what that is. With the parts successfully printed, I can slice them off the print bed with a sharp scalpel. They've come out really cleanly and should need minimal cleaning up once I've removed the supports. And here they are, all cleaned up and ready for assembly, except that isn't going to happen just yet. The gun barrels themselves are quite vulnerable, and being made from brittle resin, I expect them to get broken eventually. To get round this, I'm going to cast them in pewter, together with the side intake. I do this by making cold cure silicon rubber moulds. You can see exactly how I make and cast from these moulds in my how-to series. This is a technique I use regularly, and is great for duplicating parts that need a bit of strength to them. The castings do need a fair bit of work to make them presentable, but it's worth it. With the castings fully cleaned up, the guns can be finally assembled. I've drilled out the ends of the barrels, which makes a lot more sense than the blanked off studio scale version. The parts fit together well, and I think the guns not only look credible, but match the original studio model pretty closely. Let's now see how they look on the fully detailed main hull of Slave 1. Adding the detail finally brings Slave 1 to life. Now it's starting to look like the ship we know and love from the Star Wars universe. All the lines of the model look good, and all the panel lines and details all line up logically, with none at odd angles. Given what I started with, I'm really pleased with what I've achieved so far on this build. I'm really enjoying Project Slave 1 and starting to think about what I should build next. If you have any ideas, post them in the comments, although I do have a pretty strong contender already. There's still a long way to go before Slave 1 is finished. I won't be painting Slave 1 until all of the parts have been made and fitted. It's still going to get a lot of handling, and any paint is going to get a lot of wear, so you'll have to wait a while before Slave 1 gets his war paint. In the next episode, I'll start to tackle the underside and wings. Most of the parts for the wings and engines on the studio scale model were sourced from plastic kits. That's something I won't be doing. I don't have the resources for that. I'm going to have to do some re-engineering to get the wings to fit well, but that's all part of the joy of scratch building. Another issue is how I'm going to mount and display my model. Well, I have a few ideas. Hopefully that won't be too big a problem. Slave 1 is now getting very heavy and a real handful, so I'll have to come up with something pretty substantial. I hope you're enjoying Project Slave 1. If you are, please share with your friends and make sure you subscribe to my channel. So you catch my next video when it goes live, click on the bell icon. As you can see from my channel, I always have lots of projects going on, which I hope you find interesting. These range from my staples and vine models, featured in Sarah's vlog, to short projects and my popular how-to series. If you have any questions about Project Slave 1, just leave them in the comments and I'll get back to you. Thanks for watching.